August 15, 1971. Sunday afternoon. Camp David, Maryland. The kind of heat that doesn't move. It just presses. Against the pine trees. Against the roof shingles. Against the closed windows of a wood-paneled room where history is about to be rewritten without witnesses. Inside, 15 men sit in silence. No secretaries. No transcripts. No paper trail that a future generation can subpoena. Only the numbers. In 1945, the United States held roughly 13,000 tons of gold, a mountain of metal that made the dollar feel like physics. Heavy. Real. Unarguable. Now it's 1971. And the mountain is shrinking. 8,000 tons, maybe less by autumn. If the run continues, if the world keeps showing up at the window asking to cash in its dollars, then the vault will go dry. 5,000. 3. None. And the terrifying part is this. It isn't happening because America is weak in the usual sense. The country still looks unstoppable. Aircraft carriers. Factories. A currency that sits in every bank on earth. But beneath the surface, the math has turned. In that room, the president speaks for 18 minutes. 18 minutes to end a promise made at Bretton Woods, that dollars could be turned into gold at $35 an ounce, that the world's reserve currency had a leash, a constraint, a boundary. The decision is final. Tomorrow, the United States will announce it can no longer convert dollars into gold. The gold window closes. And something ancient wakes up. Because when money stops being a promise you can redeem, it becomes a promise you can only enforce. 3 years later, a new deal is made, quietly, through channels that don't show up on front pages until decades after the fact. Saudi Arabia agrees to sell oil only in dollars. The world's most essential commodity will be priced in America's currency. Dollars backed by, what? Not gold. Not silver. Not a fixed limit. Only the world's largest military, and the implicit message that the rules are no longer negotiated. They're defended. Was it monetary genius? Or the beginning of the end? America didn't invent the game of dying money and desperate wars. It inherited it. And the disturbing thing, if you zoom out far enough, is how familiar the inheritance is. Because every empire that played this game before, Rome, Spain, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Japan, made a final bet that looked, from the inside, like strategy. But from the outside looks like a curse. They launched their most destructive wars not when they were strongest, but precisely when their currencies were collapsing. That is the dark pattern nobody talks about. Conventional wisdom says declining powers pull back. Conserve. Negotiate. Accept smaller borders and a smaller role. History says the opposite. When the money starts failing, empires don't retreat. They accelerate. Rome kept expanding military pay even as silver coins turned to copper. Spain launched the Armada while drowning in bankruptcies and defaults. Austria-Hungary issued its ultimatum to Serbia while its budget was disintegrating. Nazi Germany began World War II with an economy running on hidden debt, debt that could not survive peace. And America fought its longest wars, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, while the dollar lost its gold backing, its reserve share began drifting downward, and the national debt climbed into numbers that would have sounded like fantasy in the Bretton Woods era. So why? The usual explanations don't fit the timing. Militarism is too blunt. Plenty of militaristic states don't launch world-ending wars at the exact moment their money starts breaking. Miscalculation happens too often to be random. Imperial arrogance explains pride, not the clockwork precision of when the escalation arrives. There's something else. Something structural. Something that keeps happening regardless of culture, century, or political system. Here's the dark answer. Empires go to war before their money dies because war is the last way to force the world to keep using money that's becoming worthless. It isn't madness. It's math. When a currency collapses, trade slows. Then it stops. Contracts get rewritten. Credit freezes. Merchants refuse your paper. Workers demand real goods. Provinces and allies start asking a question no empire wants to hear. Why are we still playing your game? And when trade stops, empires fragment, because empires are not held together by flags. They're held together by flows, taxes, wages, shipping, credit, enforcement. So if you can force the world to keep pricing essential resources, grain, silver, oil, in your failing currency, you buy time. Maybe years. Maybe decades. And if you are the leadership staring at collapse, that time isn't just economic. It's political survival. Admitting your money is dying is admitting your power is dying right now. War, by contrast, offers a gamble. A horrible one. But a gamble that feels like resurrection. And once you understand that, every major war starts looking different. Not like a sudden burst of irrational violence, but like the final stage of a monetary system trying to keep itself alive by force. Before we trace this pattern through centuries, we have to understand the psychology that makes leaders choose war even when the odds are bad. Because the key is this. Leaders don't make decisions in a vacuum. They make them inside a story of loss. In 1979, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky described something that would later become crucial to political science, prospect theory. People don't evaluate choices in absolute terms. They evaluate them relative to where they think they should be, relative to a reference point. And when they feel they're winning, they protect. When they feel they're losing, they gamble. Imagine a casino. You're up $200. Someone offers you a coin flip. Heads, you win another $200. Tails, you lose everything you've won. Most people refuse. They're in the gain domain. They want to lock in the victory. Now imagine you're down $200. Same offer. Heads, you get back to even. Tails, you're down $400. Suddenly, the bet looks different. Not because the odds changed. Because your psychological position changed. You're already losing. The coin flip becomes a chance to erase the pain. That is how declining empires think. Their reference point is not today. It's the memory of yesterday, unquestioned dominance, easy credit, a currency everyone wanted, and a world that followed their lead. As the currency debases, as inflation rises, as foreign creditors demand revaluation, as gold drains out of the vault, the leadership perceives itself in the lost domain. The status quo guarantees decline. So even a high-risk war starts to look rational. Not moral. Not wise. Rational in the cold, survival-oriented logic of power. And then the second mechanism clicks into place, diversion. The older idea, rooted in theories of group solidarity under conflict, is that when internal unity collapses, elites manufacture external enemies to restore cohesion. But in failing empires, there's a sharper variant. Monetary diversion. War doesn't just distract. War enforces. It becomes a tool to keep the world using the hegemon's currency, by attaching that currency to something essential and guarding the pipeline with soldiers. This is where psychology meets economics. Leaders in a declining empire face a binary choice. Option A, admit insolvency, devalue, accept loss of global dominance. That is not just an economic adjustment. It is political execution. Option B, initiate high-risk conflict to seize resources, compel acceptance of the currency, and externalize internal rot. Option B might fail. History says it usually does. But it offers a non-zero chance of survival. And that's enough for a regime staring into the abyss. Now, if this still sounds abstract, it won't for long. Because the first case study is not modern. It's ancient. And it's not about barbarians. It's about coins. Rome didn't fall because an enemy was stronger. Rome fell because its money died. And its money died because emperors chose to pay for wars by destroying the currency itself. The Severan dynasty, beginning in 193 CE, faced a brutal reality: the empire's professional army demanded cash wages and accession bonuses. Loyalty had a price tag. And the treasury didn't have the metal. So Rome did what failing powers always do when the bills come due and the political cost of taxation is too high. It diluted the money. It shaved the silver. It pretended the coin was still the coin. And in the next part, you'll see the mechanism in detail: how debasement became policy, how inflation became inevitable, and how the Roman army evolved into something more than a military force. It became a currency enforcement machine. Because when the money starts dying, the empire doesn't negotiate. It sends soldiers to the marketplace. Rome didn't wake up one morning and decide to sabotage its currency. It backed into it, step by step, until the sabotage became the only lever left. Because the Roman Empire wasn't just an idea. It was a machine. And machines run on fuel. For Rome, that fuel was the army. A vast professional force stretched across frontiers from Britannia to Syria, a standing apparatus that had to be paid, fed, equipped, and bribed into loyalty again and again. In the early empire, the system worked because Rome expanded and extracted. Conquests brought spoils. Provinces paid taxes. Trade flowed. Silver coins meant something. But by the early 3rd century, the empire's center of gravity shifted. The emperors were no longer stable, long-reigning administrators. They were often soldiers elevated by troops, ruling in a climate where legitimacy wasn't inherited or voted on. It was purchased. And the price was immediate. Accession bonuses. Cash distributions to soldiers at the moment a new ruler claimed the throne, because without that payment, the army would simply choose another emperor. That is the hidden hinge of Rome's monetary collapse. Political survival was denominated in coin. The Severan dynasty begins in 193 CE, with Septimius Severus. He faces a loyalty crisis and responds the way leaders often do when they need stability fast. He pays. He expands the army, estimates suggest by roughly a quarter, and raises legionary base pay, dramatically. It was popular with soldiers. It was politically intelligent. It was fiscally lethal. Contemporary estimates suggest that these changes swallowed the vast majority of imperial revenues, numbers often framed as near 90% once the full cost of military commitments is counted. Whether the exact figure is 80, 85, 90, the point is the same. Rome's budget became an army budget. And when a state's finances become a single obligation, it loses flexibility. It loses the ability to absorb shocks. It becomes brittle. So the treasury faced a choice. Raise taxes. That risks provincial revolts and elite resistance. Cut military spending. That risks immediate mutiny and assassination. So Rome reached for the third option, the quiet option, the one that doesn't require a vote or a decree that angers the masses. Debasement. The denarius had once been a silver coin that people trusted because it contained what it claimed to contain. Over time, its silver content began to fall. Under earlier emperors, it might have contained 50 to 60% silver in some periods. Under Caracalla, 198 to 217 CE, it drops below 50% and keeps falling. And Caracalla introduces the perfect symbol of monetary illusion. The Antoninianus. Marketed as a double denarius. But it contained only about 1.5 denarius worth of silver. A coin that announced itself as twice as valuable, while physically being less than twice as valuable. That is not economic decay. That is policy. That is the state declaring, reality will be what we say it is. And here's the most important part, the empire didn't merely debase randomly. Metallurgical studies of surviving Roman coinage show a pattern, an intentional trajectory, not an accident. This wasn't a few corrupt mint officials skimming silver. This was an empire adjusting the monetary base like a thermostat, turning it up whenever the political temperature rose. The mechanism is simple. It always is. Reduce precious metal content while maintaining the same face value. You mint more coins from the same amount of silver. You pay the army. You keep taxes unchanged on paper. And you transfer the cost to everyone else, merchants, farmers, provincial taxpayers, through inflation and declining purchasing power. It's taxation by stealth. But stealth taxes have a consequence. They corrode trust. And once trust goes, the empire has to replace it with force. By the mid-3rd century, prices are rising sharply relative to the earlier baseline. Soldiers begin to notice their wages by less. And soldiers, unlike peasants, are armed and organized. So they demand higher nominal pay and bigger bonuses. Which forces the emperor to mint more coins. Which makes the coins worth less. Which forces soldiers to demand more. A feedback loop. A currency death spiral. Now zoom in on the numbers that reveal the scale of the crisis. Between 235 and 270 CE, just 35 years, Rome experiences something almost unbelievable, dozens of claimants to the imperial throne. The exact count varies by historian depending on who is included as a legitimate emperor versus a usurper, but the story is unchanged. The throne becomes a revolving door. And every rotation comes with a price, an accession bonus, often equivalent to years of pay, distributed in a single burst to lock down loyalty. With a standing army around hundreds of thousands, the fiscal impact was massive. One new emperor could mean tens of millions of denarii in sudden, forced spending. And the coin reflects it. In this period, the silver content collapses to levels so low that calling the coin silver becomes almost propaganda. By late crisis stages, coins can fall toward single-digit silver percentages, functionally bronze coins wearing a silver costume. Meanwhile, mint output explodes. During stable periods, production might be manageable and predictable. During crisis, mints produce coin at an industrial tempo. Rome isn't just fighting on frontiers. It's fighting the math inside its own treasury. And here's the part most people miss. When debased coins flood the market, people don't just accept them. They adapt. They hoard older, higher silver coins. They avoid transactions. They move toward barter, local currencies, anything that holds value. And that creates the real threat to empire, not invasion, but fragmentation. Because if Gaul, Britannia, Africa, Syria stop using Roman coin, then Rome can't extract resources. Taxes don't arrive in the expected medium. Soldiers can't be paid in a currency no one accepts. Trade routes clog. The imperial machine loses lubrication. So what does Rome do? It does what empires always do when monetary consent disappears. It sends the army. Not just to defend borders, but to defend circulation. The late Roman army begins to function as a monetary enforcement mechanism. Legions stationed in major cities and trade routes ensure that transactions occur in imperial currency. Merchants and taxpayers are required to accept coins at official value regardless of metal content. Refusal, hoarding, alternative systems, these become punishable. And you can feel how grim it is when you picture it. A marketplace. A farmer trying to trade grain for tools. A merchant refusing a coin he knows is mostly copper. And nearby, a soldier stands, silent, making sure the coin is accepted anyway. This is war as monetary policy. Not metaphorically. Literally. The soldiers aren't only defending Rome from external threats. They're defending the currency itself, the fiction that keeps the system running a little longer. Eventually, the old system collapses. By the time Diocletian takes power in 284 CE, the denarius is effectively dead. Transactions increasingly occur through barter and taxation in kind, grain, oil, goods. Diocletian responds with radical reform, new coinage, harsh controls, and permanent militarization of the economy. Rome survives the crisis, technically. But the cost is catastrophic. Economic vitality in the western provinces never fully recovers. Military consumption crowds out investment. Trust is replaced with coercion. And the template is written in stone. When money dies, deploy the army. Now fast forward 12 centuries. Different continent. Different empire. But the same spell. Spain controls the Americas, floods Europe with silver, and still ends up bankrupt. And what Spain does next will show you something even darker than debasement. When money fails, an empire doesn't just enforce currency. It starts extracting resources directly, by occupation. By requisition. By force. Because if your money can't buy what you need, you take it. And that's where the Spanish story begins. At first glance, Spain should have been immune. No empire in history had ever experienced anything like it. From the early 16th century onward, ships crossed the Atlantic carrying unimaginable wealth. Silver from Potosi and Zacatecas poured into Seville in volumes that rewrote Europe's balance sheets. By modern estimates, between 1520 and 1650, Spanish America delivered roughly 150,000 tons of silver and 250 tons of gold to the crown. It was the largest transfer of precious metals the world had ever seen. And yet, somehow, Spain was almost always broke. This is the paradox at the heart of the Spanish Empire. An empire drowning in silver. Perpetually insolvent. The explanation lies not in corruption or incompetence alone, but in a structural trap, one that would later repeat itself in industrial empires with fiat currencies. Spain's silver did not build a diversified economy. It financed war. Relentless, overlapping, continent-spanning war. Under Philip II, 1556 to 1598, Spain fought simultaneously against the Ottoman Empire, France, the Dutch rebels, and eventually England. These were not short campaigns. The Dutch revolt alone consumed decades, draining resources with no decisive resolution. And wars don't wait for treasure fleets. Silver arrived irregularly. Some years brought massive shipments. Other years brought storms, piracy, delays, or nothing at all. But soldiers had to be paid on time. Contractors demanded cash. Allies expected subsidies. So Spain borrowed. From Genoese bankers. From German houses. From anyone willing to advance funds against future silver. Interest rates climbed into double digits, 12%, 14%, sometimes higher, because lenders understood the risk. By the late 16th century, debt service alone exceeded new silver revenues. This is the moment the pattern locks in. Spain wasn't borrowing to invest. It was borrowing to survive. To roll over previous debts. To keep armies in the field. And when the math broke, as it always does, the crown defaulted. 1557, 1560. 1576, 1596. For sovereign defaults under Philip II alone. Each time, creditors renegotiated. Each time, Spain promised reform. Each time, war resumed. This is not failure by accident. It is the fiscal military state eating itself. Military historian Geoffrey Parker estimates that between 1566 and 1598, Spain spent roughly 250 million ducats on the Netherlands war alone. For context, average annual American silver revenue hovered around 2 million ducats. Spain was spending more than 100 times its New World income on a single theater, funding the gap through debt and monetary manipulation. Eventually, the debt trap tightened. And once again, the empire reached for debasement. Spain's version wasn't subtle. The vellon, a copper-based coin, was repeatedly recalled, reminted with lower metal content, and reissued at the same nominal value. The crown pocketed the difference as seigniorage. On paper, nothing changed. In reality, prices exploded. By the early 17th century, inflation in Castile was so severe that parts of the economy collapsed into barter. Peasants refused to accept coin that lost value by the week. Tax compliance fell, not out of rebellion, but survival. And this happened at the worst possible time. Because Spain's military demands were peaking. Between 1618 and 1648, the 30 Years' War consumed Europe. Spain maintained armies approaching 300,000 soldiers across multiple fronts. Annual military costs reached roughly 40 million ducats. Crown revenue? Around 12 million ducats. American silver by then? About 4 million. The gap, nearly 30 million ducats per year, was financed through forced loans, debt rollovers, and further debasement. By 1627, purchasing power had collapsed to a fraction of its earlier value. Grain prices in Seville rose sixfold in 2 decades. Local economies stopped functioning normally. And here's the crucial shift. When money failed, Spain didn't just enforce its currency. It replaced taxation with conquest. Spanish armies in Germany during the 30 Years' War were granted authority to provision themselves, on the land. In practice, this meant forced requisitions of food, labor, livestock, backed by violence. The army became the state's extraction mechanism. Not metaphorically. Literally. Regions under Spanish occupation experienced depopulation, famine, and agricultural collapse, not primarily from combat, but from systematic resource seizure. War wasn't separate from fiscal policy. It was fiscal policy. The failure of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is usually told as a naval story. But financially, it marked something deeper. Military expeditions had stopped generating returns. England's naval disruption of treasure fleets didn't just hurt Spain militarily, it severed the monetary artery that sustained Spanish dominance. By 1650, Spain had lost its hegemonic position. Its currency fragmented. Regional systems replaced imperial coherence. The lesson was brutal but clear. When money fails, war escalates. And when war fails, empires fracture. Now move forward again. Early 20th century. A continent bristling with railroads, factories, and nationalism. An empire held together by bureaucracy instead of silver. Austria-Hungary. And here, the pattern becomes almost mechanical. Austria-Hungary was structurally unstable by design. 2 parliaments. 2 fiscal systems. 1 shared military budget funded by customs revenues that, by law, could not run deficits. By 1910, military spending consumed nearly 90% of that shared budget. There was no flexibility left. When Bosnia was annexed in 1908, it triggered immediate fiscal stress. New military expenditures required new taxes. Hungary refused. By 1914, Austria-Hungary's military spending per capita lagged behind every other great power. Strategically inferior. Financially constrained. And facing decline. The ultimatum to Serbia in July 1914 was not just diplomatic brinkmanship. It was a preventive gamble, a military solution to a fiscal problem. Victory promised legitimacy, resources, and survival. Delay promised insolvency and internal collapse. And hovering over all of this was the gold standard. Under gold, you couldn't simply print to fight wars. Money supply was chained to reserves. Expansion required gold inflows, or deflation so severe it risked revolution. Every power knew war would break the system. They went to war anyway. Because once again, leaders facing decline chose the gamble. Within months of fighting, every major belligerent suspended gold convertibility. Money printing exploded. And by the end, currencies lay in ruins. Austria-Hungary's crown lost 99% of its value. Prices in Vienna rose 60-fold. The empire dissolved. But the lesson learned wasn't avoid war. It was prepare better next time. And the next time came faster than anyone expected. Because the trauma of German hyperinflation in 1923 planted a seed that would bloom disastrously after 1929. And in the next part, you'll see how fear of inflation led to austerity. How austerity led to extremism. And how Nazi Germany turned war into a deliberate solution to a debt trap. Not as ideology, but as economics. Germany's trauma wasn't theoretical. It had a date stamped into its collective memory. 1923. A year when money didn't just weaken, it disintegrated. People carried banknotes in baskets. Salaries were paid twice a day because prices rose by lunchtime. Savings evaporated in weeks. The middle class, clerks, teachers, shop owners, watched their entire lives dissolve into paper. And when a society experiences that, it doesn't just fear inflation. It worships stability. Even when stability becomes self-destruction. So when the Great Depression hit after 1929, Germany's leadership did something that, in hindsight, looks almost like a slow-motion political execution. Instead of stimulus, they chose austerity. Chancellor Heinrich Brüning cut spending, raised taxes, reduced unemployment relief, slashed wages. On paper, it was discipline. Responsibility. A refusal to repeat 1923. In practice, it was economic suffocation. Unemployment surged toward 30%. Businesses collapsed. Hunger returned to cities that had barely recovered from the last shock. The social fabric, already brittle, shredded. And here is the hidden mechanism people miss. Austerity isn't just an economic choice. It's a psychological weapon, because it pushes a society into the lost domain. It turns millions of people into gamblers looking for a miracle. That is how democracies become unstable. And radicals understand this instinctively. Hitler didn't create the Depression. He exploited what austerity did to the German mind. It convinced people that the current system offered only guaranteed loss. So when the Nazis took power in January 1933, they inherited an economy at the bottom of the abyss. Capital flight. Credit constraints. Trade weakness. Foreign exchange scarcity. Reparations and debt obligations hanging like chains. Technically, the country was insolvent. It could not maintain normal life without breaking rules. So the regime broke them. Not loudly. Quietly. Ingeniously. With instruments designed to hide the truth long enough to build momentum. The architect was Hjalmar Schacht, head of the Reichsbank and economics minister, an operator who understood that modern empires don't need silver mines to expand. They need credit. But Germany's credit was poisoned. So Schacht created a workaround, Mefo bills, a form of hidden government debt issued through a shell company that allowed rearmament spending to stay off the visible budget. Defense contractors were paid with paper that functioned like money. Those contractors could discount it at banks, and the Reich quietly guaranteed the whole structure. On the surface, deficits looked manageable. Underneath, the state was running a massive, accelerating debt engine, financing armaments as if the future would pay the bill. And here's the crucial twist. Inflation didn't explode immediately because the regime suppressed it. Price controls. Wage controls. Labor discipline. The currency didn't collapse in public because collapse was made illegal. Instead of inflation showing up in prices, it showed up in shortages. In rationing. In empty shelves. In a society where the numbers remain stable while reality becomes unstable. By 1939, the German system faced a hard boundary. Not ideological. Physical. Germany lacked oil. Rubber. Certain metals. It needed imports. Imports required foreign exchange. Germany didn't have it. Because it was running trade deficits and had been cut off from international credit. So the regime hit the wall that every debt-based war economy eventually hits. You can print domestic money forever. But you cannot print foreign resources. And the internal documents, memoranda, economic planning records, later testimonies, show the recognition spreading through the machine. Further rearmament was economically impossible without either importing raw materials Germany couldn't afford, or seizing them. So war became the solution. Not just to expand territory. To solve a balance sheet. This is the gamble for resurrection in its purest form. The invasion of Poland in September 1939 wasn't merely strategic. It was fiscal. Poland's agricultural output, coal, labor, and reserves could be extracted to sustain German mobilization and domestic stability. When the war expanded, France, the Low Countries, then the Soviet Union, each conquest was evaluated partly as an extraction project. France's gold reserves were seized. Industry was repurposed. Food was redirected. Factories dismantled. The Reich wasn't just fighting. It was feeding itself on occupied Europe because its monetary system couldn't buy what it needed anymore. And the more it consumed, the more it had to expand. Because extraction has a fatal property. It creates dependence on further extraction. If your economy is built on conquered resources, peace becomes impossible. Peace is when the bill arrives. War delays payment, by taking. Now look east. Because Germany wasn't alone. Imperial Japan faced a parallel crisis, but in a different form. Japan was a resource-poor island empire dependent on imported raw materials, oil, rubber, tin, iron ore. In normal times, this is manageable. You export manufactured goods, earn foreign exchange, import what you need. But the Great Depression crushed export markets. Commodity deflation meant Japan's exports fetched lower prices. Foreign exchange became scarce. And the military interpreted scarcity not as an economic challenge, but as a geopolitical trap. If you depend on imports, your empire can be strangled. So Japan pursued a deliberate strategy of autarky, building a self-sufficient empire through conquest. Manchuria in 1931 wasn't only nationalist ambition. It was an economic claim: coal, iron, agricultural land. Full-scale invasion of China in 1937 was framed as securing resources and markets. Military spending soared from single digits of the national budget to roughly a third by the late 1930s. Deficits expanded. The yen weakened dramatically over the decade. And then came the choke point. By mid-1941, the United States imposed an oil embargo in response to Japanese expansion into Indochina. Suddenly Japan faced a timer. Oil reserves, roughly 2 years at peacetime consumption, less than 1 year at wartime levels. And the naval staff knew the arithmetic. Without seizing the Dutch East Indies, the Imperial Navy's operational capability collapses. So Japan chooses war. Pearl Harbor. Not because they believed war with America was easy. But because the alternative was guaranteed collapse. This is prospect theory at state scale. A regime in the lost domain becomes risk-seeking. A 10% chance of survival through war feels better than a 0% chance through accommodation. Both Germany and Japan shared the same fatal belief. That rapid conquest could outpace economic exhaustion. But the numbers never supported it. Germany's wartime oil consumption averaged around 8 million tons annually. Even with Romanian oil and captured resources, supply fell short. Deficits ate pre-war reserves. By 1944, the synthetic fuel system was shattered. The Wehrmacht became a mechanized army running out of gasoline. Japan's oil situation was worse. Production from occupied territories peaked below needs. The merchant fleet, Japan's supply chain, was destroyed. Once the sea lanes died, the empire starved. And this leads to a terrifying conclusion. Economic collapse preceded military defeat. Germany fell after losing access to oil, fuel plants, and industrial capacity. Japan surrendered after being cut off from resources it had conquered to survive. War didn't fix monetary desperation. It converted it into national ruin. Now, here's where the pattern becomes modern. Because after World War II, America inherited Britain's position. And America inherited something else. The privilege and the trap of being the currency everyone needs. Under Bretton Woods in 1944, the promise was simple. The dollar would be as good as gold. Convertible at $35 an ounce. Other currencies would peg to it. This gave the United States what a French finance minister later called an exorbitant privilege, the ability to issue currency that the world accepts as reserves. But privilege comes with a contradiction, later formalized as the Triffin dilemma. To supply enough dollars for global trade, the U.S. must run deficits. Deficits push dollars abroad. As dollars accumulate overseas, gold backing becomes insufficient. Eventually, foreign holders realize the U.S. cannot convert everything. Confidence cracks. And then comes the moment we began with, 1971. The gold window closes. And the system needs a new anchor. So it turns to oil. And oil requires enforcement. Which brings us to the final act of the story. The petrodollar system, the military network that sustains it, the long wars of late empire. And the question hanging over the present. Is America now inside the same gamble, just with different technology, different rhetoric, and the same ancient math? When the gold window closed in 1971, it didn't just end Bretton Woods. It removed the last physical constraint on American power. For the first time in modern history, the world's reserve currency was no longer tied to a scarce resource. Its value floated, anchored only by confidence and necessity. And confidence alone is never enough. So necessity had to be engineered. The solution emerged quietly, not through treaties ratified by parliaments, but through strategic bargains made in the shadows of geopolitics. By 1974, the framework was in place. Oil, the bloodstream of the industrial world, would be priced exclusively in dollars. Every nation that needed energy, and all modern nations do, would need dollars first. If you wanted oil, you had to enter America's monetary system. In return, oil producers, especially Saudi Arabia, would receive security guarantees, weapons, protection, and political backing. Gold had backed the dollar before. Now energy would. But energy isn't passive. It sits in volatile regions. It attracts challengers. It creates temptation. Which meant the new system required something gold never did. Permanent enforcement. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the petrodollar system cannot exist without military power constantly signaling its willingness to act. Carrier groups in the Persian Gulf. Air bases across the Middle East. Security pacts, arms sales, training missions, intelligence cooperation. This wasn't imperial vanity. It was monetary architecture. Every base, every fleet, every alliance reinforced a single message. Oil stays priced in dollars. Challenge that rule, and the consequences will not be financial alone. And whenever a regime tested the boundary, history followed the pattern. Iran, after 1979, attempted to chart an independent path, facing decades of sanctions and pressure. Iraq announced euro-based oil pricing in 2000, 3 years later, it was invaded. Libya proposed a gold-backed African currency in 2010, within a year, the regime was gone. Each case is debated endlessly on moral and strategic grounds. But the monetary through line is undeniable. Challenge the currency system, and conflict follows. Because under the petrodollar system, the currency's survival depends on continued global demand. And global demand depends on pricing essential commodities in dollars. Which depends on force. So America enters what previous empires entered before it. A self-reinforcing loop. Military spending protects dollar demand. Dollar demand finances deficits. Deficits require continued dollar demand, which requires military enforcement. The circle closes. And for a long time, it works. Foreign nations recycle petrodollars into U.S. Treasury bonds. Deficits remain painless. Living standards stay high. The bill doesn't arrive. Until it does. By the early 21st century, cracks begin to appear, not as collapse, but as erosion. The dollar's share of global reserves starts to slide. Slowly at first. Then measurably. China and Russia pursue bilateral trade outside the dollar. Sanctions are weaponized, freezing reserves, cutting access to payment systems. And in doing so, the United States demonstrates something crucial to the rest of the world. Dollar reserves are not neutral. They are conditional. Accessible only as long as political alignment holds. This changes behavior. Central banks diversify. Gold accumulation accelerates. Alternative payment systems emerge. Not because nations want chaos, but because they want options. And this brings us to the present moment. America's fiscal position today looks eerily familiar when placed against historical precedents. Debt rising faster than GDP. Interest payments approaching defense spending. Persistent deficits that require continuous foreign absorption. And instead of retrenchment, what do we see? Rising military budgets. Expanded strategic commitments. Global base networks maintained at enormous cost. This is not coincidence. It is the pattern asserting itself again. Because from the perspective of leadership inside the system, the options are the same binary choice empires have always faced. Option A, accept adjustment. Reduce military reach. Allow the currency's global role to shrink. Absorb economic contraction. Face domestic political backlash. Option B, maintain enforcement. Escalate where necessary. Preserve demand. Buy time. Option A guarantees loss of power. Option B offers uncertainty, but not zero. And prospect theory tells us how humans choose under those conditions. They gamble. This is why declining empires don't glide downward. They spike. They lash outward. They increase risk. They seek decisive moments that can reset the trajectory. They tell themselves this time is different. Every empire believes that. Rome believed its reforms would stabilize the system. Spain believed silver would always arrive. Austria-Hungary believed a quick war would restore authority. Germany believed conquest would solve debt. Japan believed resources could be seized faster than they were consumed. Each believed it had found the exception. None had. And here is the most sobering truth in all of this. Understanding the pattern does not stop it. Because the pattern is not driven by ignorance. It is driven by incentives. Leaders who accept decline rarely remain leaders. Leaders who promise restoration, even through dangerous means, are rewarded. Political systems select for risk-seeking behavior when societies enter the lost domain. That is why gradual adjustment almost never happens. It requires collective acceptance of pain. And pain creates challengers. So history bends toward escalation. The final stage of monetary imperialism is not peace. It is enforcement. Not because leaders are evil, but because the system leaves them no palatable alternatives. This is the dark symmetry that runs across 23 centuries. When money fails and power erodes, empires don't step back. They step forward, into conflict. And every time, the wager fails. Not immediately. Not cleanly. But inevitably. Because war cannot fix a broken monetary foundation. It can only delay the reckoning, while increasing the cost. Rome fragmented. Spain faded. Austria-Hungary dissolved. Germany and Japan collapsed in ruin. The lesson is not that war never works tactically. It is that war never solves the structural problem that caused it. Yet the temptation remains. Because delay feels like survival. And survival feels like victory, right up until it doesn't. The question facing the present system is not whether the pattern exists. It is whether it can be broken. And history offers little comfort. Because the logic that drives empires toward the gamble for resurrection operates independently of wisdom, morality, or hindsight. It operates through incentives. And incentives do not care about memory. They care about power. If this unsettled you, that's because it should. Because the pattern isn't a theory. It's a recurrence. And we are not watching it from outside history. We are inside it.